Hi, in this webinar, I'm going to go through some multiple choice questions to help you with some with the exam paper on economics. So what we'll do is, I think there's about 20 multiple choice questions, each with an option of 4 possible answers. And we're going to explain why one of those answers is the correct option. So I'll just share the screen and fire away with some questions. If you have any, you might see it in the chat, the group chat on the right-hand side of the screen. So I hope you can see this exam paper that I'm going to look through, the macroeconomic environment, and it's a repeat paper for 2014. So in this section A, you're going to have 20 marks. You have 20 questions, and each is going to be 2 marks each. So the first question addresses the circular flow model. So this is a macroeconomics paper. So the circular flow model, for every flow of goods, services, and resources, there is a counterflow of, and the answer here is money, D. So why is it not any of these? Well, with a circular flow, the circular flow model is known as the circular flow of income. And money is the means of exchange. And when you have firms who are selling goods to households, and households are also providing labor for the work that they do, there's an exchange of money rather than barter. So your counterflow is money in order to pay for the exchange or the flow of these goods or services. Question 2. 4 categories of expenditures that make up GDP are consumption, investment. And then we have another 2. So if you're aware of GDP or aggregate demand, there's a key formula that you need to know, and that's your C plus I plus G plus NX. And we already have here consumption, which is your C, your investment, which is your I, and then we need government spending or expenditure. So we have government purchases for A and B here, and also C. And we need the net exports, which is exports minus imports. So your option that we need to have here is your option C. A and B are almost there, but they're not complete. We have net exports in here as well, but it's not just government transfer payments. It's your purchases or your spending that the government needs to contribute to help with GDP. Because at the end, we have here the category of expenditures. Okay, this table here refers to a number of questions that come after it. Refers to the 4 questions 3 to 6. So we have 2 goods, oranges and DVDs, and we have the prices and quantities for 2 of those years, 2011 and 2012. And we're told the base year is 2011. And what the base year is really when it comes to creating an index or like inflation, but a base year is your starting year in which we move on from. So question 3, referring to this table, real GDP in 2011 is. So real GDP, firstly, to explain this, it differs to nominal GDP. And what nominal GDP does is it takes account of the change in GDP as well as the change in prices year on year. Real GDP is your price multiplied by your quantity for all goods collectively. So for 2011, we have 2 multiplied by your 500, which will give us 1,000 euro. And we have 100 multiplied by 400 euro, which will give us 40,000 euro. So your answer here we're looking for is a total of 41,000. Your 1,000 plus your 40,000. And we see your answer here is option D, 41,000. Question 4. Again, referring to the table, real GDP in 2012 is. So what we need to take into consideration here for real GDP in 2012, we should not use the same calculation as we had done in 2011. In other words, we do not multiply price by quantity for both goods and then add them together as we had done previously. That's what's called nominal GDP. What we need to do is to get real GDP is to keep prices constant. That way we can get the real growth in output or productivity. That's what real means. We want to see what really happens to productivity without having to see price changes that contributes to an overall GDP change. So real GDP in this case is keeping your prices constant. In other words, using the base year price of 2, we multiply that 2 by your 400 units. So 2 by 400 is your 800 euro. And likewise, we multiply your old price of 400 euro by your new quantity of 200. So we have 80,000. So in total, what we have here is 80,000 and an 800 that we calculated with the 400 by your 2 euro. So your total is 80,800. Your answer is again option D. Some people may mistakenly multiply 3 by 400 and 300 euro by 200. Okay, that's wrong. That will not be a real change and that will not identify real GDP. So question 5 then, again referring to the growth rate. And I think I'll have to do an Excel calculation on this just to get the figures there to show you how it's done. So again, with the growth rate, we identify the change in, your answers. We need answers. We need the answers from part 3 and 4 in order to answer this correctly. So question 5 is dependent on what you got in the previous 2. So the change here is going from 41,000 to 80,800. And we need to calculate that change. So it's your new figure minus your old figure divided by your old figure. So your new figure was 80,000. Your old figure, 41,000. To get the change, your new minus your old, divide that by your old, and we multiply by 100%. We have 97.07%. So we're looking for that in our answer. This video will be available again afterwards. So if you want to look back on it, on how I did this, just fast forward to where we are and you'll pause and rewind and play it again. So there we have the 97.07%. Again, answer D. Okay, if the CPI is your consumer price index, and that tracks how prices have grown year on year or fallen year on year. So it tracks what's known as inflation or deflation in an economy. So if it was 132.5 at the end of 2013 and 140.2 at the end of 2014, we're looking for the inflation rate over this period. Please do not subtract one from the other and just leave it like that. In other words, 140.2 minus 132.5. That's not your answer. Your formula here is identical to the one we just looked at in question 5. In other words, you choose your new figure, which is your 140.2 in this case, minus your old figure, 132.5, and you divide that by your old figure. So again, it's just going to show that in your Excel file. That was your new figure. $132.5. New minus old divided by your old figure. We can multiply that again by 100 to get it as a percentage. .81%. And there we are, 5.8%, option D. Okay, question 7. Real GDP per person. Okay, so per person, I'm just looking at it here. In terms of the options, we see by the number of workers, by total population, or by number of workers. Now, GDP is a measure of productivity. So some people might automatically assume that it's to do with workers, because if we don't have any workers, we don't have productivity. Okay, but that's the wrong thing to look at, because we need to take into consideration the whole population. So your answer has to be either B or C based on this part of your solution, by total population. Okay, so given that you have real GDP per person, has to be real GDP. It's real GDP divided by total population. If this answer was nominal GDP per person is defined as, well, then your answer is B. So in this question 7, your answer is C. Okay, question 8, the unemployment rate. Okay, so we have a couple of similar, all the options look quite similar. All I'm seeing is during recessions and during expansions. So your answer is going to lie in the first part of those options, as in rises or falls. Okay, so unemployment rate. By looking at it, A seems to be your answer. It rises during recessions and falls during expansions. And that's a theoretical solution. There are cases where unemployment would actually fall, or would actually rise during expansion. Okay, and that's known as stagflation. But in this, I suppose the basic understanding of unemployment and how it actually changes during recessions and expansions, your answer is A. And there could be a debate about this, okay, but I suppose that's at a different level. Okay, we're talking about basic economics here. Question 9 then. The government has a budget surplus when government spending. Okay, so governments either have what's known as a budget surplus or a budget deficit. And a budget surplus typically occurs when spending is less than the revenue that the governments earn in terms of the tax receipts. So government's income is known as their tax revenue, and their expenditure is known as their government spending. So with a surplus, you spend less than you receive. So your answer here is option B. So government spending is less than tax receipts. Again, this question could be asked differently, but quite similar. The government has a budget deficit when government spending. Now, a deficit again is when you spend too much than you actually receive in tax. So your answer would be, in that case, A. Okay, but for this question 9, the budget surplus is when government spending is less than tax receipts. Question 10. Which of the following is not included as part of the monetary policy? Okay. So monetary policy has to do with money, or the flow of money, or anything associated with money. And we see here, option A, the level of government spending. Oh, that seems to suggest that it is associated with money. And by right, it does. Okay, spending means spending money. You have also B, which is your money supply. So that is definitely monetary policy. The level of interest rates is the price of money. So that definitely also is the monetary policy, because you can adjust interest rates. like the way you could adjust the supply of money by printing more or printing less. And D is the sale of government bonds. That's definitely monetary policy. Some people may go for that option, okay, which is the wrong answer. D is definitely a part of monetary policy because governments can buy and sell bonds in order to adjust the amount of money that goes and enters and leaves an economy. So going back to A, the level of government spending is actually a fiscal policy. So please be aware of the differences between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is to do with taxation and government spending. So answer for 10 is A. That is not part of the monetary policy. 11. Which of the following will not shift the long run aggregate supply curve rightwards? Okay, I think it's a good idea to show a diagram, and fortunately we have a diagram of this later on in the multiple choice question. So here's a typical diagram of your long run aggregate supply curve mixed in with aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. So LAS here refers to the long run aggregate supply, and it's a vertical curve. So let's just ignore everything else and concentrate solely on the long run aggregate supply curve. Remember, this relates to or is similar to potential GDP. So here you have GDP, or some others might call it GNP. This is the level at which the economy has the potential to grow. And it's a slow moving curve in that it's dependent on a number of factors that could affect how this actually shifts to the left or to the right. And when it shifts to the left or the right, it's a parallel shift to this, and it remains vertical. So let's go back to that question. Okay, which will not shift the long run aggregate supply curve rightwards. So rightward shift means GDP is growing, if you remember the bottom, the x-axis on that diagram. So the economy will grow. So an increase in the level of education of the labor force, I think that will definitely cause a rightward shift in the curve, because when the labor force is more educated, it only expands the economy in terms of foreign direct investment coming in and producing here, looking for an educated workforce, and people being more educated to create startups, etc. An increase in the size of the labor force is definitely a cause of a rightward shift. So you have more labor, and they contribute, and we have the potential to grow. So they contribute to the economy in terms of productivity. Technological change is definitely a cause of a rightward shift. So if you have an improvement in technology, such as, say, for example, what we're doing right here now, social media on a webinar, this could be seen as some level of productivity, especially if you're a for-profit firm. So this has the potential to grow GDP. An increase in the price level, that will not cause a shift. And it has connotations here with microeconomics. If there's any change in prices, that causes a movement along a curve. It doesn't cause a shift in a curve. So these three do cause a shift. Your answer for question 11 is option D. An increase in the price level does not cause a shift in the curve. And again, this question could be posed in another way. What causes a shift in the long run? And you could have these three options, and then part D could be all of the above. And your answer then would be all of the above. And again, which causes the curve to shift leftwards. Okay. So we have a technological change. If there's a huge disimprovement, or a decrease in the size of the labor force, a decrease in the level of education, a war could wipe out parts of society, or you could have mass emigration. Okay, so those will cause a decrease in the curve itself. Okay, question 12, the quantity theory of money. Okay, this topic in itself on the quantity theory of money is a popular question in a when you're doing a long form exam part of the question. So say, for example, here in this paper, it'd be section B. So you have the quantity theory of money. Prices are rigid, velocity of money and real output are variable. Changes in money supply causes changes in velocity of money. The velocity of money will be constant. Okay, your answer here is D, option D. The velocity of money is assumed constant. So my advice here, and I don't have time to cover it, is to look at the formula for the quantity theory of money, identify the relationship between, say, money supply and velocity and output, and be able to answer some of those and even do calculations, because there are possible multiple choice questions that could be done further on the quantity theory of money. In this question, I think that's the only one on QTM. Okay. Which one of the following types of unemployment will exist even if the wage is at competitive equilibrium? Okay. So wage is at a competitive equilibrium. Remember, you have to think through these. Don't rush into answering these type of questions. You could be given, as we were told here at the opening of this exam, 2 marks per question. You have 20 questions, and assume a mark a minute. So you should be spending around 2 minutes on each question in order to think through it. Obviously, don't you might answer some a lot quicker than others, and you might have extra marks or extra time to answer section B to your question. But don't rush into it, and give a bit of thought when you're looking at something like this. And you have to understand what we mean by sectoral, structural, cyclical, and frictional. Okay, say for example, I'm not certain, but sectoral unemployment, I'm sure that's to do with changes to the sector, and if there's I don't I don't necessarily know if there's an actual definition of this, and it's just maybe an option, it's something that's made up, but I'm sure there is. But these are the main three. Cyclical employment is where it follows the business cycle. So if you have a boom period, you have less unemployment, and you have a recessionary period, you have more unemployment. Okay, so wage levels could actually change as a result. Structural unemployment is more your long term, whereby you might have an industry that ends up being closed down. So, for example, you had coal mines, the mining industry in the UK at the moment is undergoing some structural unemployment or threats to structural unemployment. Agriculture in Ireland since the 1900s onward has experienced structural unemployment, whereby we were replaced by machines. Your answer here is frictional. Frictional unemployment is very short term unemployment. So people will be unemployed for a matter of a few days or a few weeks or a few months before they find another job. So that unemployment will exist even when wages are at a competitive equilibrium. So you could be in your economy could be performing well, could be performing poorly. You're in a job, you end up leaving, or you become somewhat redundant. The your employer no longer needs you, and you end up getting a job at an equally competitive rate of wages. You don't have to suffer a cutback or a reduction in wages in order to compete to find someone else, or in order to compete with somebody else to get that job. So your answer here is your frictional unemployment still will actually exist even in if wages remain at a competitive level. Okay. 14. Efficiency wages are lower than market wages paid by employers. Okay, so we have something similar in A and B, are lower or higher paid by employers, profitability, productivity. Okay, so these are key words because every other word is the same. Let's go on to C, because I'm thinking that it's A and B. Option C, government determined minimum wages are set to protect workers from unfair employers. That is definitely not efficiency wages. When governments interfere in a market, you have intervention. For example, your minimum wage, that does not create efficiency. That creates inefficiencies in the marketplace. So that is definitely not answer C. D, negotiated by unions when officials are interested in trimming workforces. No, that again is interference, and it's not allowing the market to determine what the actual efficient wage or the equilibrium wage will be. So C and D are not your answers. So we're going back to A and B. So efficiency wages. So we're going back to this here, this word productivity. Even though in economics, the main aim of firms is to maximize profits, but we're talking about a macroeconomy here where that still stands as well, but we're talking about productivity. So employers want to increase productivity, and the efficiency wages then become higher as a result. They may perhaps want to, some background to this, they may perhaps want to attract the best employees that give higher levels of productivity without any what's known as diminishing returns. So you don't want to employ somebody who actually does not have that higher level of productivity. You want to, look, you see it in a lot of firms. For example, um, I think some executives from Tesla are moving over to another company, and some executives from and CEOs and CFOs from Yahoo have left and moved on to another company, perhaps Google or Apple, and they're getting higher wages, and that hopefully increases the productivity of the firm when they employ them. Okay, 15. When fewer euros are needed to buy a Japanese yen. Okay, so it's definitely not inflated. You don't say inflation. You could have a devaluation, but that's more of an action prompted by government interference. So the terms we use are appreciation or a depreciation. And an alternative word for appreciation is strengthened, and here depreciated would be weakened. So if you have fewer euros to hand over to buy yen, it means that your euro has strengthened. And that is associated with answer C. Okay. So don't think that fewer euros because you have fewer. It suggests weakened or depreciated. You are able to buy a Japanese yen with fewer euro, meaning that your euro has strengthened. If the question could also be asked when fewer euros are needed to buy a Japanese yen, the yen has, in that case, depreciated. So look out for those slight, subtle changes in questions. A country's balance of international trade is negative. Okay. So again, we have exports and imports. Right. Yeah, you're gonna be focusing on A and B here because they solely deal with imports and exports. So which is it? A country's balance of trade is negative. If you have a negative trade balance, it means that you were importing more than you export. And that's like you as a country spending more money on goods and services than you are actually selling. So if you're spending more than you're selling, you have what's called a negative trade surplus. So your answer here is C. Okay, 17. A decrease in French incomes. Okay, so decrease in French incomes. And then we have here in your options, Irish aggregate demand for both of these. Actually, for all of them. Okay. Right. It's definitely not A and B. And the reason why it's not A and B is because we see here what's known as a movement along the aggregate demand curve. And as I referred to earlier on in a question, the only variable that causes a movement along an aggregate demand curve is prices. Okay. So if there's a change in price, that causes a movement along a demand curve. So we're left with option C and D. So a decrease in French incomes causes a shift in aggregate demand curve. That's correct, but which one is it, left or right? Okay, let me think. How would French incomes cause an Irish aggregate demand curve to shift? I'm trying to create a story in my mind. And again, this is theoretical. and may not happen in reality. Right. To be honest, I'm left uncertain on the answer here. Let's look at one possible explanation as to why perhaps the Irish aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Say, for example, here we have it. There's a diagram to help us out with it. So here you have Ireland's aggregate demand curve starting at AD0. And it could either shift to the left or shift to the right based on French incomes falling. So French incomes falling, if French incomes fall, it means that they may have less purchasing power to purchase goods from abroad, for example, and that could cause a fall in Irish exports. And if there's a fall in Irish exports, that's part of your aggregate demand. Remember, your aggregate demand curve is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption, government spending, investments, and net exports. So if exports fall, you could have a fall in aggregate demand. So you have a shift in your aggregate demand curve to the left. That's a possible explanation there. Another one would be French incomes falling. Therefore, I'm trying to look for an alternative where aggregate demand could shift out to the right for the Irish economy. Let me think. So French incomes decrease. And to be honest, I'm not sure. You'd have to go 50-50 on that, to be honest. Sorry, I can't really help you out with this one. 18. In figure 1 below, which is what we referred to twice already to help us out with previous questions, point C here represents an inflationary gap, and full employment equilibrium, a recessionary gap, or a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so it's definitely not a decrease in aggregate demand because aggregate demand is just shifted out to the right. So we can rule that out. Full employment equilibrium, we can rule that out as well. Okay, full employment equilibrium really is associated with point B. So we have to understand this diagram. So again, this is your potential level of GDP, this long run aggregate supply curve. And the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, say for example, they're intersecting at point B, that represents your actual GDP. So where the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, your actual GDP happens to fall on your long run aggregate supply curve, meaning that you're also at your potential. So the economy is almost at that equilibrium. However, if we move aggregate demand out to the left to A, what you have is a fall in aggregate demand. See, GDP has fallen at that intersection from 7 down to 6.5. So there's a fall in actual GDP below potential. And if actual is below potential, on a business cycle diagram, you have what's known as a recession. And a recession is usually associated with or known as a recessionary gap. So this almost triangular period here would be a recessionary gap, or also known as an unemployment gap. If aggregate demand moves from AD0 to AD1 here, what you have is growth in the economy. So this intersection at point C shows real GDP at 7.5. So we have a growth in GDP or actual GDP above potential at 7. So you have growth in the economy. And with economic growth or expansion, that usually causes an increase in prices because of the extra demand that's put in the economy. So this here is known as an inflationary gap, this triangular area. So point C represents an inflationary gap. So your answer for question 18 is A. Again, just look out for subtle changes to this question. We could say in figure 1 below, point A represents a recessionary gap, or also known as an unemployment gap. 19. The most direct way in which money eliminates the need for a double coincidence of wants. Now, you need to understand what that means, double coincidence of wants. And just a brief explanation on it. Some say that money was created in order to alleviate a number of problems. And the main problem was the barter system. And what a bartering system entails is somebody like myself, if I had a particular product and I wanted another product, so say, for example, if I had butter and I wanted to buy chicken, I would have to look for somebody who's selling chicken and also wants butter in exchange. So if I go to a market and I see someone selling chicken, they may not want the butter from me. They may be looking for bread. So what I might have to do then is go look for somebody with bread and swap the butter for bread, and then bring the bread back to the chicken seller and swap the bread for the chicken. So double coincidence means you have to coincide with somebody else who is also willing to exchange their product for your product. So that's a huge problem. And what money does is it solves that problem. So money, by us all having money, I just go and exchange money for the chicken, and that guy also exchanges his money for bread, and the guy who's selling bread exchanges his money for butter. So we don't have the problem of the double coincidence of wants. So your answer here for 19 is that money eliminates the double coincidence through its use as a medium of exchange. So money is a medium of exchange. It allows us to exchange money for goods. Okay, and the final question, final question 20. Figure 2 below. So again, we have, and they're not labeled, but you might recognize them. This vertical line is your potential GDP, which is also known as your long run aggregate supply. And we happen to have 3 of them, A, B, and C. And this diagonal, which is upward sloping, is your short run aggregate supply. And we've those 3 scenarios. So we've no aggregate demand curve here. So it's a very unusual diagram, but it's just creating some scenarios. So B is the current long run aggregate supply curve. So this is the current one. So we have to start at this point. And D is the current short run supply curve or aggregate supply curve. So we're starting at this B and D intersection. Technological advances causes the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve too. Okay, and we have the options A to D. So think about it in advance, and sometimes it's helpful to do this. What happens to your potential level of GDP, firstly, if there's a technological advance? And we already addressed that in a previous question. We would expect your long run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. And with that, your short run aggregate supply curve would also benefit. That would be the first one to change, to be honest. So short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, so too does your long run aggregate supply curve. So we will go from B to C for the long run, and we will go from, let me see, so B to C, and we will go, yes, the short run will go from D to E. So your answer is answer D. It shifts to C and E respectively. Okay. That's everything in terms of doing the multiple choice questions. And I hope that was quite helpful. And I hope you learned a lot from that. I know there may be situations where I went by the questions or the choices or explanation a little quickly, but you have the benefit of seeing this and playing it back on YouTube. And I'll send you the link on if you wish. If there's any other questions that you want me to go through, let me know and email them to me, and I could do the same walkthrough. Okay, thanks for watching and really appreciate it.